We are in week 5 of our course, Come to Papa, Encountering the Father Who Heals Our Deepest Pain. And in this week 5, we want to focus on a particular topic of the Father's heart that I believe is central to understanding who He is, how He feels, how He relates to those that He loves and that He brings back to Himself. We're in the 15th chapter of Luke, and in last week's sessions, we focused on the searching Father, the one who goes out after, who sent His Son into the world to seek and to save that which was lost. And in Luke 15, we find a series of parables that focus both on those that have wandered away from the Father's house and those who have gotten lost within the context of the Father's house. In the first parable, the parable of the lost sheep, we saw the Lord Jesus focusing on the tax collectors and sinners as the lost sheep who had wandered away, but also on the Pharisees and the teachers of the law as the shepherds who were responsible for their own actions in allowing the sheep to go astray and to not acting like the true shepherd, presenting Jesus as the true shepherd, the one who lays down his life for his sheep. In this session today, I want to talk about the embracing Father. In the third parable rather of Luke chapter 15, the parable of the two sons, it's commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son. The word prodigal means lavish and extravagant, and I prefer to think of it as the parable of the prodigal father, because what we see in this parable is the extravagant, lavish love and mercy and grace of our Papa God. And so I want to read that passage from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And actually, in this session, I'll just read from verses 11 through 24, and then we'll focus on the rest of the parable tomorrow. And so here it is. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the portion of the goods that falls to me." So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father, but when he was still a long way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But his father said to the servants, 'Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to be merry." Well, in this story, we see perhaps the clearest insight into the tender heart of the Father who longs for the restoration of his children to the Father's household. Now, in the first parable, the lost sheep, he presents himself as one who goes and seeks those who are lost, who are snagged and caught and trapped in the ways of the world. And in this parable, it's about a son who has purposefully and intentionally wandered away from the Father's house, thinking that he had to leave the Father's presence in order to have a good time. Here's this young man. He's yearning for the far country. Somewhere in his heart, even though he had everything he needed, he's sort of the classic second-born son. He's confident. He's full of himself. All of his provisions have always been there. The Father's heart has been open to him, and he has just assumed his place in the family and in the Father's house. And he begins to somehow get a glimpse of that far country, and his heart begins to yearn for things away from the Father's house. And he hasn't learned that the Father is a Father of great joy, of celebration. And the younger son has kind of made up his mind that if he's going to enjoy himself, if he's going to have his own way, if he's going to fulfill his desires, he's going to have to do it away from the Father's presence. And so he heads into the far country, and what he doesn't realize is that he's going from a place of full provision where his spiritual and emotional and physical umbilical cord is plugged into the Father's house, into the Father's resources, and he doesn't realize that he's headed into a consumer culture where everyone is out for themselves, and there is no place to plug in that is really feeding, because everybody is looking for something to feed themselves. See, we were created to be strengthened and nurtured from outside sources, and that source, God intended it to be His heart, His presence, His embrace, the context of the Father's house. Not a limited place of restraint, but a full place of provision and grace and mercy. Meaningful labor in relationship of intimacy with the Father, and all those kinds of things. And so what happens is this younger son, in his desire for the far country, he unplugs himself from his resource base and heads down the road to the far country, not realizing that his umbilical cord is trailing in the dust behind him. Now, he still has the residue of all of the Father's provision. His pockets are full. The Father divided the inheritance between the two sons. His pockets are full with his share, but that resource is no longer endless. As long as he was plugged into the Father's house, that resource was self-replenishing. The Father gave him everything he had. Everything in my house is yours. But the moment he left the Father's house and unplugged, his resource became finite, just what he could carry in his pockets. But he still carries the residue of the warmth and the anointing and the blessing of the Father's house. He's unsullied. He has not yet been contaminated in the far country. And I can just imagine he goes into the corner bar and he's going to meet some people and he's going to have a good time. And he's generous because the Father has been generous. He's grown up in the context where there's generosity and lavishness and provision. So he becomes the resource for everybody else, not knowing that they are a consumer-oriented group. And when he walks in the door, they all look at him and say, "Oh, fresh meat has walked into the room, something to feed my soul." And he becomes the source of enjoyment for everyone else, wasting his possessions in prodigal living because all of that consumer culture is pulling on him for everything he's worth. And he doesn't understand that as soon as his resources are gone, he's going to be put aside and they're going to be looking for the next guy to walk into the place. The inevitable happens. He runs out of resources. He wastes his possessions. And as it would happen, just coincidentally, not so coincidentally at all, there comes a famine in the land. He begins to be in need. How many of you know that there's a difference between beginning to be in need and actually realizing that I'm broke and busted? And so he says, well, I've still got some ideas. He says, I can go get a job, I can work. And he goes out, and the only job he can find is feeding pigs in a neighboring feedlot in that far country. Now, you got to understand, the imagery that Jesus is using here as he's talking to these tax collectors and sinners in this part of the story is he's saying, this is the worst possible scenario for a young Jewish boy, feeding pigs in a foreign country. Pigs were considered unclean. And this young man was so hungry, so hurting, that he desired to feed himself off the pig food. And that is a picture of the broken place in our hearts when we realize that we are out of resources and we find ourselves feeding on the stuff of the world that is really death to us. Finally, it says in the text that this young man comes to his senses. He came to himself. He saw things as they really were. That's what that phrase means. And he says, this is stupid. My father's servants have everything they need to eat and plenty to spare, and here I am starving to death in this foreign country. This is a mess. I will arise and go to my father. Now look what has happened to him. Shame has set into his heart. He's lost not only his provision, because his pockets have been emptied, but he's lost his sense of identity. He's lost his sense of belonging in the Father's house. And so he says, my only hope is to go back to the Father's house and hope to be hired on as a servant, to become one of the servants in my Father's house. Being a servant in the Father's house is better than being free in the world's consumer system, where they eat you up and spit you out. And so he heads back, bedraggled, to his father's house. But he doesn't understand the Father's heart. The Father's been interceding for him. The Father's been praying over his life. And as the Father gazes out over the road, suddenly he sees his son coming in the far distance. And he hikes up the robe around his knees, undignified as can be, and he runs to his son and embraces him. And the text literally means he fell on his neck and could not stop kissing him. And he embraces him and he says, look, son, I know what you need. Come in here. Come in here. And he holds him to his chest. And how many of you have ever been in that kind of condition where you're so ashamed and so broken that you're like a fence post if someone would want to hug you? There's no response in you. I had a situation like that in my college days. I had done some stupid things over the course of a summer, even working for the college in this small Mennonite town where I went to school, and wandered away emotionally and spiritually from the Lord. And it was a little Mennonite town, and you couldn't get in a lot of trouble, but whatever trouble there was, I got into it. And I came very close to being kicked out of my school. And on the first day of registration classes, I was sort of making my way despondently to the library to register, and all of a sudden there came walking toward me the dean of the school, Dr. Prieb, and he was a very godly, kind man, but he was the last man I wanted to encounter in that moment. I was too ashamed and too filled with my own sense of worthlessness there, because I had brought shame on the name of the school and on my own name and on the name of the Lord. And so I moved to the side of the sidewalk to walk past him, and I glanced up, and he had moved over right in front of me. And I moved back to the other side, and he moved with me, and I realized he means to encounter me. And I braced myself for the spanking that I knew I deserved and I thought was coming. And as he came up to me, he put his arms around me, and I was in that stiff place, and he just put his arms around me and drew me near, and he kissed me on the cheek, and he said, "Welcome home, Gary." And I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for mercy and welcome in the heart of a father. And that's what this young man experienced. The father embraced him, couldn't stop kissing him, and he pushed him in a way, and he said, "Father, wait, I've sinned against heaven and against you." And the father said, "Yes, that's right." And then he said, "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." And before he could get out his request to be made a servant, the father says, "Wait a minute." And in effect, the Father is saying, do not presume in your broken condition to understand my heart for you. Do not interpret my attitude toward you in the light of your brokenness. Here's who I am. And he calls the servants and he says, dress this son. He's my son. He's home. Dress him. Put the robe on him, put the shoes on him, put the ring on him, put the robe of identity on him, put the shoes of ownership, put the ring of authority, and you stay by him and you make sure he stays dressed. He got a little brain damaged out there in the foreign country. And he calls the servants and he says, get the fatted calf killed. We're going to have a celebration. My son who was dead is alive again. And Jesus is speaking directly into the hearts of these tax collectors and sinners who have wandered away from the Father's house. And he's saying, I am here in the Father's name to embrace you and to welcome you. My prayer is that you'll get to know a Father like this one, a Papa whose heart is full of the desire to welcome you back into his mercy and into his grace. As you perhaps imagine yourself in the younger son's position, what are the attractions in the far country that pull you away from the Father's heart? And consider those things. And has there been a person or persons in your life who has modeled the Father's mercy and grace to you? If there has, give thanks to the Lord for that person. And come back to the Father's heart. Wherever you're wandering, come back. The Father's arms are open and he welcomes you. May the Lord bless you as you consider these things.